Coming over to the lab section. The first of these 2-week labs is going to be lab 9. So that means about 2 weeks from now, we'll have lab 10, which is going to be the second of the 2-week labs. And then after that is just going to be the bonus lab, lab 11. That's pretty much going to be it for the semester. So we've got about 5 or 6 weeks left. So go ahead and take a look at this one, which is going to get into kind of what I describe as the second half of chapter 5. Basically now we're just going to be focusing on being able to solve just simple problems using methods. So if you've already looked at the video for the bank account balance, then most of what you're going to see in this lab is going to be very similar to that one, where you're going to be dealing with some set of options in an input dialog box. You will choose from those options to perform certain individual tasks that all kind of come together as one kind of simple application. It also includes the while loop to make sure that you kind of stay on the application until the user actually chooses to close it. So there's a lot of similarities between this lab and the example that I used in the last video for chapter 5. So for this one, the title for this lab is going to be Read and Write. And you can also see based on the due date, this is going to be due on April 7th, so 2 weeks from now. The lab is going to focus on using methods to solve a problem. You must also make use of dialog boxes and file I/O in order to complete the program. So you'll go ahead and create a project called Read and Write, and then your first and last name, or lab 9 and then your first and last name. You also have to remember to include comments describing your program. And similar to lab 8, for this lab, you must also include documentation comments for each method that include the proper annotation tags. So for this one, we're going to end up with 2 additional methods besides the main method. And for each of those 2 additional methods, you're going to have to include all of the documentation comments with the things like the return and the param tags in them. Okay. So then going through each one of the different steps for this lab. First, you want to go ahead and make sure you include the proper imports to use things like the JAP Champagne and Scanner classes, as well as all of the classes from the IO package. So we're going to need the JAP Champagne class since we're going to have a series of input and message dialog boxes. You will need the Scanner class because we will eventually be reading from the file as part of the overall application. And then, of course, you're going to need everything from the IO package since that includes all of the other actions and cases that you want to be able to handle when it comes to file I/O. The main method will be making calls to methods that deal with file I/O. So you also have to remember to include a throws clause in the main method header. For these next couple of steps, all of this is going to be what you see in the body of the main method. So you want to keep that in mind. So you'll go ahead and declare 3 string variables. The first is going to be used to hold the user's choice of an action to perform. So that's basically going to hold those options of 1, 2, or 3 inside of it. The second is used to hold the name of a file provided by the user. So depending on exactly which options you're trying to take, there's going to be other additional inputs that the user needs to provide, regardless of whether they want to read from a file or write to a file. In both of those cases, they need to give the name of the file that they want to actually do that with. So you will have to make use out of that particular string for both of those cases. And then the third string is going to be used to hold a line the user wants to write to the file. So that one's specifically when you're dealing with the writing. So once you've got those 3 string declarations out of the way, then the next part is going to be the actual while loop that contains all of the set of options to choose from. It's kind of the main aspect of the program. So you'll go ahead and write a while loop that will continuously run as long as the user is using the program. And then the program will be terminated if the user selects option 3 out of the list of options that's going to be specified in more detail in step 5. So then once you're actually in the while loop, you'll go ahead and display an input dialog box asking the user to select an option. So you can see samples of message dialog boxes at the end of the lab directions. And then the user's input should be stored into the string variable for their choice. So we'll take a look at that once we get to the very end of the directions. Then in step 5, this is going to give you the actual breakdown of what each one of those different options will actually need to do. So you'll want to go ahead and write either if, else if, and else statements, or a switch statement for options 1, 2, and 3. And then the else or default that you're going to be using, that's going to be if the user provides invalid input, and then you just want to kind of let them know what the correct inputs are supposed to be, and then just repeat the initial request from there. So we've got 4 different possibilities here for options 1, 2, and 3, and then the last one for that default case. For option 1, this is going to be to write to the file. So 2 input dialog boxes will be needed, one to request the name of the file, and then one to request the contents to write to the file. This option will also require a call to the write to file method, and then you're going to also pass in both the file name and the contents to the or within that method call. For part B, option 2 is to read from the file. For this one, you'll just need one input dialog box to request the name of the file. This option will also require a call to the read from file method with the file name passed into that method call. For C, option 3 is going to be to exit the program. For this one, all you need to do is include a message dialog letting the user know the program is exiting before calling the appropriate method to exit the program. And for this one, I made it a little bit vague when I just said appropriate method. But again, if you're taking a look at the bank account balance problem from the videos for chapter 5, then you can see exactly what I'm talking about there. And then for option D, the else or default is going to be to remind the user of the valid inputs. So for this one, you're just going to display a message dialog stating the options are 1, 2, or 3. Okay. So all of those are going to cover what you need in the main method. For the remainder of these steps, this is going to get into what goes into both your write to file and read from file methods. So steps 6, 7, 8, and 9 right here. All of this is going to correspond to the write to file method. And then I'll kind of scroll down just briefly. Steps 10, 11, and 12 right here. These are going to deal with the read from file method. So going through these steps here, starting from step 6, the first custom method to make will be the write to file method. This method accepts a string for the name of the file to write to and a string for the contents to write in the file. And this method does not return anything. So based on that, that's giving you a little bit of a hint about what the method header should look like. So that's telling you what the parameters for it should be, telling you what the return type should be. And then also make sure you include a throws clause since the method will be used for file I/O. In steps 7, 8, and 9, this is getting into the actual body of this method. So you'll go ahead and construct a file writer object using the passed in file name. The file writer will allow content to be appended to the end of the file rather than overwrite existing content. And then you want to go ahead and construct a print writer object using the file writer object. In step 8, you'll go ahead and write the passed in contents to the file and then display a message dialog box stating that you successfully wrote to the file. And then finally, in step 9, you want to go ahead and make sure you close the output file when you are done. As a heads up, since this particular step is really short, really small, just remember that if you're not seeing anything being written into the file, it's probably going to be because you forgot to close it at the very end. And then getting into steps 10, 11, and 12, this is going to be for the read from file method. So the next custom method to make will be the read from file method. This method accepts a string for the name of the file to read, and this method does not return anything. So again, just like what I did for the write to file method, this first little bit right here is just clarifying what should go into the method header. So just clarifying what the parameter should be and what the return type should be. And then also make sure you include a throws clause, since again, the method will be used for file I/O. For step 11, you'll go ahead and construct a file object using the passed in file name. You can declare a string for the contents of the file that is going to be initially empty. And the reason that we want to go ahead and construct a file object using the passed in file name is because then in step 12, we want to actually go ahead and check to see if that file exists. If the file does exist, then that tells us we can go ahead and read from it. So we'll go ahead and construct a scanner object to read from the file. While the file has content to read, so keep in mind that little key part right there, while the file has content to read, we will continuously read each line and concatenate that to the string variable in this method. You'll also need to include a new line character at the end of each line. This way, just to make sure that it isn't just one long statement, just kind of going all the way across. We want to go ahead and kind of break that up into individual lines so that it kind of matches up with what it looked like inside of the file itself. After reading the file, you'll go ahead and display a message dialog box stating that you successfully read from the file, and you want to go ahead and include the contents of the file in that dialog box. And then, of course, remember to close the input file when you're done. Depending on exactly how this ends up working, if you forget to close it after you're done reading from it, that should end up giving you some problems if you try to write to it later. Most likely, if you forget to close the reading stream, when you try to write to it, it just won't work or just won't do anything. Or it might even give you a little error message about it. And then if the file does not exist, just display a message dialog box stating that you failed to read from the file. Okay. So then going through the criteria, so comments describing the program, including the documentation comments for the methods, are going to be worth 10 points. You have to make sure that you include documentation comments for the read from file and write to file methods. The imports and the string declarations in the main method are going to be worth 6 points total. So that's covering the first 2 steps. Properly writing the while loop with the input dialog box and conditional code for the user's choice is going to be worth 32 points. So that's going to be for steps 3, 4, and 5 covers all of that. The header of the read from file method is going to be worth 6 points. Then the body of the read from file method is going to be worth 25 points. The header of the write to file method is worth 6 points. And then the body of the write to file method is going to be worth 15 points. So you'll notice based on this that there's a little bit more weight to the read from file method since the way that one's set up. I will go ahead and say now that the read from file method is slightly more difficult to complete and have everything working than the write to file method. Okay. So then if we go ahead and scroll down, we can go ahead and take a look at all of the different input and message dialog boxes for this. So the first one right here, this is going to be the very first input dialog box that is displayed when you first run the program. So this is going to be with the list of options for the user to select from. So right here, you can say, please select an option, and then includes things like option 1, write to file, 2, read from file, or 3, exit program. Then the following right here is just going to be the set of input dialog boxes, and then the final message dialog box related to option 1. Specifically, this is going to be the set that you would see if the write is successful. If for whatever reason it ended up failing, which admittedly is kind of difficult. There's weird things that would have to go wrong for it to fail. So I didn't really worry too much about accounting for that. But this is basically what it's going to look like whenever you have a successful write. Where you've got the first input dialog box asking for the name of the file, the second input dialog asking for the line that you want to write to the file, and then the message dialog saying that you successfully wrote to the file. And I guess one other thing to clarify, keep in mind that these 2 input dialog boxes, these are going to be used in the main method. So that's where you're going to see the code for those. But this message dialog box is being used in the write to file method at the very end of, or kind of the second to last thing that you're going to have in that method, just before you close the file. Then the following is going to be set of input dialog boxes and the message dialog box related to option 2. So for this one, I went ahead and just showed both the input dialog box asking for the name of the file to read from, and then showing the 2 different cases that you could have. So the first one is showing what happens when you have a successful read, and then the second one is showing what happens if you have an unsuccessful read. So this means that whatever file I was reading from actually existed, and then this one is showing that whatever file I tried to read from did not yet exist. And then, of course, you'll also notice that the contents of the file, so in this case, I just use a really simple statement like hello world as the contents for it. You can see those being displayed in that message dialog box. And then these last 2 cases right here are going to be for option 3, or if you have some kind of invalid input. So the following is going to be a message dialog box related to option 3, which just indicates that you're exiting the program. And then this is going to be the message dialog box related to making an invalid selection, where you're just reminding the user that the options to pick from are going to be 1, 2, or 3. Okay. So that's going to cover everything for the directions. In a second, I'll go ahead and switch over to Netbeans to do a quick run of this, so we can kind of take a look at everything as it actually plays out in real time. But before I switch over to do that, does anybody have any questions about the directions to the lab so far?
So this is all one project, right?
Right, yeah.
Okay, so I just want to make sure. Okay.
Yeah, so you'll notice, I suspect at this point, everybody's kind of noticed that this one is a fair bit longer than the other labs, which kind of plays into the fact that this is in fact a 2-week lab.
Yeah, I saw it's like 12, 12 there, and then, yeah, okay.
Yeah. So I guess just as kind of a heads up as far as that is concerned, probably my suggestion is to try to get about half of it done within the first week. So probably get the main method and some of the read from file method out of the way within the first week, and then start finishing that up and finishing up the write to file method. You probably want to do that one first, and then finishing up the rest of that and the read from file method within the second week. Yeah, so one of the things to note is that the 11th lab at the very end of this is going to be the bonus lab. So keep in mind that there's going to be 10 required labs, and then the 11th one is kind of like a bonus. So yeah. Any other questions?
I have a question not regarding the lab, but maybe after you finish the demo, I can ask. It's about the group project.
Okay, sure. All right, so I guess we'll go ahead and take a look at that. Yeah, so we'll kind of clarify about that since I see somebody else asking about it for next week. So coming over to Netbeans, I've got the project put together already, this read and write program. So go ahead and run this. And I'll give that a quick second to display the first input dialog. Okay, so at this point, we get the first input dialog saying to please select an option, and then it shows the 3 different options to choose from: writing to the file, reading from the file, or exiting the program. So let's say that, I guess to start off with, since I've not yet done it on this computer, there aren't any text files to read from. So I'll go ahead and choose that option first, just to very quickly demonstrate what happens when you try to read from a file that doesn't exist yet. So we'll go ahead and choose option 2, push OK. We'll go ahead and get this next one right here. Please enter the name of the file to read from. So at this point, in a second, I'll go ahead and create a text file with the hello world text inside of it. So what I'll end up calling that text file is just going to be hello. So as you do this, keep in mind that depending on exactly how you end up writing it, you will probably have to explicitly specify the .txt, the extension for it. If you understand exactly what you're doing, if you want to try to set it up so that this is just kind of included in the code itself, so that you could write just this much, you're certainly welcome to do it that way. But probably I'll take a guess and say for most of you, it'll be easier to just do the full name with the extension. So I'll go ahead and try to read from this file. It doesn't exist, so when I push OK, it's going to say failed to read from file. So then when I push OK on this, it's going to go ahead and go back to the very beginning, and we'll go ahead and select a different option. So let's say that this time, I'll go ahead and choose option 1. We'll go ahead and write that file now. So then we'll go ahead and enter the name of the file that we want to write to. So I'll go ahead and do something like this. And we'll push OK. And then we'll go ahead and enter a line that we want to write to the file. So let's go ahead and do something like, say, hello world. And we'll push OK. And then it'll go ahead and tell us that it successfully wrote to the file. So this is just going to go ahead and work off of the typical behavior with the print writer class, where if that file didn't exist, it's just going to go ahead and create it automatically for me and then write something to it. So that's what it went ahead and did in the background for me. So I'll go ahead and push OK. So I'll go ahead and leave it on this option just to kind of demonstrate what I'm talking about. I'll come back over to Netbeans here and come over to Files. And we'll go ahead and see that we've got our hello.txt file right here. So I'll go ahead and open that. And I don't really need to move this much, but kind of drag that down a little bit. But we can kind of see the text right there for hello world. So then what I'll go ahead and do is to demonstrate the part where it needs to append new content to this, I'm going to go ahead and do a second write to that same file. So I'll go ahead and choose option 1 a second time. And we'll go ahead and choose the same file. We'll do hello.txt. And this time, since we've already put in our greeting of sorts with hello world, what I'll go ahead and do right here is just kind of add on to that and say something like, how's it going? Go ahead and push OK. And it will again tell us that it successfully wrote to the file. Push OK on that one. And I don't think, OK, it does automatically update. So I went ahead and automatically updated it for me in Netbeans. So we can see the hello world and the how's it going. So we now have 2 lines written to this file, and you'll notice that it didn't overwrite the original content. It just continued to add more lines to it. So now what I'll go ahead and do is actually read from the file. So I'm going to go ahead and choose option 2, choose OK. And for this one, I just need to put in the name of the file. So put in that hello.txt. There we go. So do hello.txt, push OK. and it's going to go ahead and print out the entire contents, saying that it's successfully read from the file. And in this case, because I have 2 lines, it's going to go ahead and print out both of those lines. And keep in mind that as it was doing this, I was adding in the extra new line character almost kind of manually within the read from file method, so that I could go ahead and make sure that each one of these lines is, or each one of the statements from the file itself is on its own separate line within this message dialog box. And of course, keep in mind that that clarification I made about the read from file method is that we are making sure that we continuously read every single line from the file while we are not yet at the end of it. So we want to make sure that we get all of the content from that file being displayed in this message dialog. Then push OK. Then I'll go ahead and demonstrate the last 2. So let's say I put in something like option 4 that doesn't exist. If I push OK on that, it's going to go ahead and say, please select either 1, 2, or 3. And it looks like I should probably fix that at some point. So yeah, it should say, please select either 1, 2, or 3. We'll push OK. So we've already tested out the first 2 options. So the only thing left is going to be option 3 to exit the program. Go ahead and push OK on that. And then it'll say exiting the program. And we'll push OK. And then it will go ahead and close. And if we go ahead and take a look over here, we can see that it finished with this little message in our console window here. Okay. So that's going to cover everything for the demo. Does anybody have any questions at this point about the requirements for this lab? Okay, so I think that'll cover everything for that. So the only other thing to mention now, I guess, will be the plan for next week. So next Monday, I'll be putting up the actual directions for the semester project. So you'll be able to read through all of that, get a much better understanding of exactly everything that you're going to be doing. To give you a brief idea about what's going to be happening next week, since we don't actually have another lab to kind of go over to explain, instead what I'm going to be doing is using that time to allow you guys to start putting together the groups for the lab. So you'll start forming your groups of up to 3 people. I will go ahead and say now you do have the option to do the project by yourself. I will also say that I don't really recommend that unless you feel pretty comfortable with being able to complete an entire project completely on your own. Keeping in mind, of course, that you're also going to have 2 different 2-week labs to be working on during that same span of time. So it can be a lot of work. I wouldn't really encourage it unless you feel pretty confident in your abilities. So that's kind of the plan for that. The other thing I'll note is that next week will be your chance to kind of start deciding on exactly what you'll be doing for the semester project. So I will try to avoid giving it away too much until Monday when you start reading over the project directions. But as far as ideas for the project go, you'll also be thinking through those next week.
So we choosing what project we want to do, or you're going to give us an option and we decide?
So let's say that between those 2 possibilities, I'll wait until Monday for you to find out a little bit more about exactly which one of the 2 it is.
Okay.
So I think that pretty much covers everything. So because of the fact that you'll be dealing with all the stuff related to the semester project, I do recommend that, for anybody that's watching the recording later, if you don't typically come to the labs, I would highly encourage you to be here next week to be able to put together those groups. Otherwise, you might end up being stuck having to do it by yourself when you didn't necessarily want to be doing it by yourself. So yeah, does anybody have any questions? I guess the questions that I can kind of vaguely give answers to now about what we're going to be doing next week.
So it's only one group project, right?
Right, yeah, it'll just be one group project that pretty much covers the entire month of April.
Okay.
Any other questions? All right, I'm gonna go ahead and pause here.